Hello, I'm back again, and I'm here to read the second half of chapter 8. And this is about Princess Alice and her time in Kenya right before her marriage to Prince Henry. The book really takes off and gets interesting after her marriage to Henry and details their life and bringing up William and Richard. And it was right after World War II, and they're dealing with the abdication of King Edward VIII. But this, I'm reading every single word because it really is very descriptive of Alice's time in Africa. And she lived to be 102. She's one of the longest royal people to live. I mean, she outlived, in her lifespan to live to be 102. She never drank, she never smoked. She was of hardy stock. So, um, people don't usually live that long. But anyway, I want to get started with reading this. And this is on her last and final trip to Africa. So, and I've made some pictures here. This we last left off with her watercolors, which she had to use to fund her last trip. Here she is again. These are the types of cars they use, the box cars, the Citroen cars for driving. There's no pavement. It was a whole different time. People really enjoyed their time in Africa. And this is one of our last photos. She had a camera, but the way for her to capture the colors in Africa, that's when she took up watercolor painting, because there was no other way to illustrate all the beautiful colors of Africa during that time. So, and as you can see, this is 1934, and here she is right here with I mean, she was fierce. She could handle anything, facing leopards and all that. So it was that is an experience to have over in Africa. So put this. And this is her Uncle Francis and Aunt Eileen, who she stayed with and helped. Look at her with her parasol. So she talks a lot about that. And these are the Boxby cars. Boxby cars were most usual in Kenya in those days. Mine was a Citroen. Roads, even the main roads out of Nairobi, were tracks of mud. After rain, the soil would be known as black cotton, and it became impassable like a peat bog. And these are the huts, the little huts that they'd lived in. And here's Alice right here. So I'll just park it right there. Well, I finished reading. Owing to ill health and the advice of her doctors, my Aunt Eileen decided to stay with her mother in England for a while. Her two daughters were now settled at school in England. Uncle Francis had at last made up his mind to have his wounded leg amputated and was yet still somewhat unsteady on its replacement. Knowing he would appreciate both my company and my help, and I myself longing to return yet again to the life of blissful contentment, I decided to go back to Kenya with him. The money from the watercolor exhibition enabled me to pay for my passage, and Billy gave me a further £30 with which to go buy a tent. The ones at Deloraine all being very old and dilapidated, I went to Teddy Brooke for his expert advice. Where can I get a nice tent for £30? I asked. Leave it to me, he said, and in due course a lovely tent arrived with a bill for £30. The first time I used this tent in Kenya, it caused a great sensation. What a marvelous tent! Some authority explained. I wish I could get one. I said, why don't you? Oh, he said, it's far too expensive. Not at all. I said with some satisfaction. It only cost me £30. He laughed. Oh, good heavens, it's more like £300. Then I realized Teddy asked the shop to send me a bill made out for £30 and paid the rest to himself. We went by flying boat, a pleasant journey which which should have taken only 7 days from Athens to Kisumu. Each night we had to land and put up at a local hotel. At Khartoum, the hotelier suggested that my uncle should spend the night in a new bungalow alongside where they had no stairs to climb. Alas, things did not go to plan. Just before dinner, the pilot came knocking at my door. Come quick, your uncle has had an accident. I rushed down to the bungalow and found that, in pulling himself out of bath, he had grasped a china towel rail, which snapped off and splintered, making a deep cut in his side. Luckily, his cries for help had been answered by the time I arrived, and a doctor was not long in coming. Uncle Francis had to go into the hospital for several days, and because of the airplane it only passed by on its southern journey once a week, there we had to remain. It was very hot. The town, Major, an old acquaintance, came to my rescue and asked me to stay with him and his family in their bungalow with a bed on the roof. This proved to be far more cool and comfortable than anywhere indoors. Each morning I had a delightful ride before breakfast with the governor's ADC. When the next plane arrived, however, there proved to be only one available seat. I was dismayed at the thought of being stuck in Khartoum for yet another week. But fortunately, the pilot suggested I could come along if I was prepared to take the place of the air stewardess. Naturally, I was only too pleased to do this, so I arrived in Kisumu as a temporary employee of Imperial Airways. Atlas was a stewardess. How cool is that? When my uncle was attending the Legislative Council in Nairobi, I was now left in Deloraine, more or less in charge, aided and fortunately by Loder, who stayed on as a housekeeper. One of my worst moments came when it suddenly grew very dark at midday, and looking out, I saw clouds of smoke and a grass fire rapidly approaching from a mile or so. Remembering instructions, I rang a bell to assemble the Africans. I told them to battle as best they could with flames. While I dashed around, opening gates and doors so the animals could get out if needed, luckily the wind changed and the fires turned before reaching the garden. On another occasion, it proved to be lucky that I was there. My uncle was due to return by car from Nairobi, and on that day, a long drought ended suddenly, and 4 inches of rain descended. I felt certain he would not attempt the journey in such weather, so did not sit up for him. Sometime after midnight, with rain still pelting down, his driver came hammering at my door. Please, Mahasibib, come and help. Bhuwani Lordy walking in the rain. I dressed hurriedly and we went to put chains on my car tires, warning Miss Lorder of what was happening so she could get some hot food and drinks ready. We set off, skidding from one side of the road to the other, and after some miles I was thankful to see Uncle Francis bravely hobbling toward us with the help of his faithful Eru, the Maasai servant. We were all soon safely back at Lorraine. I felt so happy to have been some real use to this brave and always cheerful uncle, for whom I had never ceased to feel the greatest admiration and affection. My knowledge of first aid, learnt while a Girl Guide and a VAD, came most useful. One morning, the gardener arrived carrying his big toe, which he had chopped off with a spade while making a bad shot at a clump of weeds. I shoved it on again and took him off all speed to Nakuru Hospital where they fixed him up. He appeared quite unconcerned and obviously suffered a little pain. Another time, the head boy, a butler, arrived with bleeding fingers, having been bitten by a rat. The neat little crisscross bandages I applied to each finger gave him immense satisfaction. He considered them extremely smart and decorative. When told they were needed no longer, he went off looking disappointed. He returned before long, bringing a tearful child with bleeding fingers, obviously having suffered cuts from scissors or a knife. My son also had been bitten by rats and needs smart bandages, he said hopefully. Needless to say, I was much upset and cross with him, but still had to do the best I could to bind the small fingers. While my uncle was in Nairobi, I went off visiting many friends around the country. And for Christmas that year, we both went again to Ripley's Capsulat. After Nairobi for the New Year festivities came a 3-week safari again to the Mara River with a party of friends. We covered a large area of this vast, uninhabited part of Kenya and Tanzania. There were no roads except for occasional remains of tracks made by the game wardens. We never came across another human soul, but there were hordes of animals of every variety. How different to the game park today, with innumerable tourists in minibuses and the game rapidly decreasing. While visiting friends at Nyeri, we spent a night at Treetops. It's a wooden building perched out of animals, reached in a large fig tree, overlooking a water hole and salt lick. It's here that rhinos and other creatures came after sunset to drink and play around. It had only just been built. I'm sure the owner had no idea how popular it would turn out to be with tourists in the years to come. Our queen and Prince Philip stayed the night there before hearing of the late king's death. In trying to think of something else of interest that we might do, one of the parties suggested we try to climb Mount Kenya, or at least get up the snow line. Only a very few people had bothered or ventured to do this, and it was really a rather mad idea for 3 women and 1 man to undertake. We set off for Nanyuki with 2 ponies and a guide borrowed from the brothers Hook, a splendid character known as Fish Hook, or Boat Hook, who ran the hotel. No road existed, and it was a walk of 21 miles from the town to the snow line, climbing 8,000 feet to 12,000 feet, and having had to cut a track through the bamboo forest so as to gain a passage from the ponies. Our guides knew by some instinct where to go, but he left us when we reached the upper edge of the forest. The Africans were very superstitious about the mountains. We camped the first night amongst the trees and the second at the margin of them, before struggling through rocks and bogs for a mile or 2 till we reached some caves below one of the peaks. It was snowing hard when we arrived, and I never felt so cold before. Added to this, I found it very painful to breathe for the first few hours. We could only squeeze our 4 sleeping bags into the largest of the caves, and the wind whistled around, making strange sounds, and it was very ghostly. The next morning we woke to hot, bright sunshine, and I and one of the party set off on horseback alongside a small stream flowing down a valley between the 2 peaks. The ponies were surprised and mystified when we reached some quite deep snow. One night in the cave was more than enough, so we scrambled down to the shelter of the forest before the dark fell. I managed to take some good photographs, and this pleased me. We were none the worse for this hazardous exhibition, which shows just how fit we must have all have been. Later that year, my uncle and I set off for Uganda to see the Merchantess Falls. Lady Moore went with us. She's the wife of Sir Henry Moore, the first secretary to the Kenyan government. They were later to be our host and hostess of the Queen's House in Colombo on our way to Australia in January 1945. It was a delightful drive across a large part of Kenya and Uganda to Budayaba on Lake Albert. From there, we went one day in a small boat up on the Nile, almost to the foot of the falls. We landed and scrambled along a rough path and a steep climb to overlook the top of the falls. It was a truly awe-inspiring sight. Since that time, I believe a road has been made and a bridge has been built above the falls. Uganda seems such a happy country, with a friendly smile on every well-fed face. I don't think anyone bothered much about work, but they appeared to exist happily in their own quiet way. About this time, an attractive Swedish film star arrived in the country, causing no little excitement. My friend, who had organized the Mount Kenya expedition, was smitten and offered to take her on safari. She accepted with delight, though I doubt if she really had any intention of going. He proceeded to plan a visit to the Serengeti in Tanganyika in conjunction with a friend who was a white hunter and invited me to complete the party. At last minute, however, he telegraphed saying that the film star had chucked. Could I find someone else to take her place? There being no telephone and letters taking ages to be delivered, all I could do was ask the girls who lived within a few miles. Though very nice, she was extremely dull and about to become a missionary, hardly a substitute for the glamorous film star. The men must have been sorely disappointed. However, we had a happy safari nonetheless and took lots of good lion photos. We called on the local game warden, who gave us advice on where to go. He's very fond of his lions and hated them being shot. A large notice near his house requested, "Please try shouting before shooting." A wise warning since people so often shot in self-defense. Thinking a lion was about to attack them, in fact, this actually would rarely ever happen. One day, a length of rope attached to our lorry happened to slip off and trailed along behind. A lioness jumped up from under a bush and pounced on it, pulling and shaking it vigorously, whereupon one of her friends appeared to join in the fun. They tugged away for a good long while aboard the lorry, a good opportunity for a photo. It was this photo I later submitted for a prize in the Kodak International Photograph Competition, and much to my gratification, it won a Diploma of Honor. One night, a heavy rain fell, making progress very slow. We were determined to reach the Ngoro crater, which entailed a steep climb, but halfway up, we were stuck firmly in the mud. One of the party walked back to get help from a homestead we had noticed on the ascent. He returned with a young German who got out his tractor and kindly dragged us to the top of the ridge where we camped for the night. The next day, we ventured out onto foot into a crater, a vast area of many water holes, teeming with game and bird life, and I told them there is now a good road and a comfortable hotel, so there will be many thousands of tourists who will have seen all this under a less taxing circumstances. As for the film star, she ran off and married Baron Blixen, Isaac Dinesen, the former husband, and that was the last I heard of her. My next unusual experience was riding safari chosen by Susan Ridley for her birthday present. We traveled by car to a spot somewhere 20 miles away, where we found our ponies awaiting us. From there, we rode along a ridge at the Serengeti Hills, camping in the open at night. The scenery could not have been more beautiful. It was somewhat like an English parkland. There was green gla- mm, There was green grass, clumps of trees, or flowering shrubs, masses of wild flowers, and a wonderful view over miles and miles of the Nandi Reserve. Buck and other small animals darted away at our approach. On our way home to Capsula, we descended through many native villages and habitats. I was more flattered to be invited to join this novel. I was very flattered to be invited to join this novel expedition. Many years later, my husband and I went again to this district for a picnic lunch, but this time we went by car. It's hard to find a shady tree to sit beneath. They and the flowering shrubs were no more, and in their place stood an untidy, tiny shacks and hordes of children, goats, and chickens. The population had moved no higher ground and better soil. Later that year, I was persuaded by my family to go to India to visit my youngest brother, George, who had recently joined the 10th Royal Hussars of Lucknow. The family decided I was much nearer to India than any of them, and it would be a good idea for someone to see how he was getting on. Owing to my elder brother Billy having previously been in a regiment, I had been known many of the officers and their wives for several years. Captain Harvey and his wife wrote saying that they'd hoped so much I would go and stay with them and offering to put up a tent in their garden for me to sleep in. The whole idea sounded most attractive, so I booked a cheap 3-month return ticket from Mombasa to Bombay and set off to visit a new continent. Amongst the passengers, who were mostly Indians and Goans, I discovered an extremely pleasant couple, an officer in the Indian Army and his South African wife, who were returning from NATO where they had spent his leave. They invited me to stay with them in Peshawar, where they were stationed at that time, and they offered to show me the surrounding places of interest and organize a hunt with the local hounds. Lord and Lady Brabourne met me in Bombay and took me to the government house for the night, putting me on the train for Lucknow the following day. I had a great welcome from my brother and his fellow officers, many of whom had affectionate memories of Billy. The tent in the garden was comfortable, and I soon settled into the routine of army life. A bicycle had been hired for my use, which I found was very helpful. It was usual and a very convenient way of getting around. Everyone had gone, and in my youth I enjoyed bicycling, so I took it again with ease and even with certain enjoyment. As it was close on Christmas, a great preparation were in progress for festivities of all kinds. There were polo matches, tattoos, dances, and parties. At these came one in contact with the entire regiment and sometimes with the KOSB, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, who were stationed alongside. Friends in the Royals would turn up occasionally for polo from their station in Meerut. Had my husband ever become colonel of this regiment, as he had so much hoped to do, all this experience would have been a great help to me as his wife. After Christmas, George went camp off to camp for 3 weeks, and I, with a brother's officer sister, went to Delhi, where we stayed with Lord Chetwood, the commander-in-chief. A greatly admired friend of my brother Billy, one of his ADCs, I'd already met on the Griggs staff at Government House in Nairobi, and the other I was to meet again on many occasions. There more than there were more than kind and took us sightseeing to the Taj Mahal and other places of interest. I found India a sad country compared to Kenya. You never saw a smile, and the children seemed especially miserable, and they were poverty stricken. Their eyes were covered with flies. I was there at an awkward time when Indians were beginning to agitate for the independence, and they were apt to be rude to English people. If you queued for a ticket in a post office, the Indian head was inclined to go with his business as long as possible, so just as to be annoying. They had recently, for the first time, been allowed to share railway carriages with Europeans, and when seeing one in a train, they would crowd in so as to demonstrate their new equality. Even though compartments either side stood empty, it was all rather trying, and particularly when they chewed and spat out beetnut juice. I said goodbye to Delhi and set off on my own again for Peshawar. More and more Indians crowded into my carriage as the journey advanced. I was thankful to reach my destination and to find my friends from the boat awaiting me. They had comfortable quarters, but no spare rooms, so had fixed a camp bed behind a screen in a corner of their spacious kitchen for my bedroom. They arranged expeditions for me to show me the district and places of interest. I was fascinated by the scenery and the wild, fierce-looking Pathan people. Potters molded lovely bowls on the pavement, and women woven gorgeous silk materials, which were also for sale in the bazaar. A dance took place one evening in the hotel, organized by the military. There were a lot of army quartered at Peshawar to quell the unrest which was already happening. I was talking to some Australian soldiers with two young Americans who were out there trying to sell cement and came and joined the party. They longed to see the Khyber Pass and look over into Afghanistan, but could not get the permission necessary to pass through what was known as tribal territory, an area between Peshawar and the pass where unruly tribes were being a nuisance. My army acquaintances knew a way through the wire fence, and some distance off the main road said they had friends in the army post at Landau Kotel on the borderline. They offered to take us along if we would like to go. This sounded exciting, and we arranged to set off the following morning. My hostess, when she heard of the plan, said she'd like to join the party, but on no account her husband must know of it. We borrowed caps and woolly Afghan overcoats with only our noses showing, hoping no one would stop us, for women were not allowed to enter the district. We got in by some secret overland route, and joining up with the main road once we were inside forbidden territory. We then lunched with an army friends in Australia, looked over the boundary gate into Afghanistan, before undergoing a rather frightening drive back down to the Kabul Pass, a road that's terrifying corners bordered by sheer drops that followed the winding course of the Kabul River far below. Eventually, we emerged by the same secret track as we had come in, safe and undetected. However, news of the escapade later got about, and there was a great row. I had left by then, but I'd already realized what a frighteningly stupid thing it was to have done. I went to visit General Alexander, who was at Rawalpindi, and then returned to Lucknow. There was already much talk of a great polo tournament due to be held at the Maharaja Jaipur. The officers were anxious that George would be given leave so that he would be in the team. They said it all depended on me getting around the commanding officer. So I made myself pleasant to the major and George got his leave. I was able to do this because the dates happily fell just within time limited imposed my cheap return ticket to Kenya. The only misfortune, as things turned out, was that I bruised my leg painfully while jumping in the cavalry school train yards. My horse slipped and crushed my leg against a mud wall along the jump, and I did the injury no good by joining a pig sticking expedition in Japar. The stick itself was too heavy for me, and my attempt at one stage to catch a runway horse of a thrown rider put even more untimely strain on the injured leg. Of course, in general excitement, I forgot all about it. We had a wonderful week, dominated by polo tournament. Several crack teams had been assembled, including one consisting of a Maharaja and his relatives, and others from America and France. The Maharaja was quite young, but already had 2 wives. They were in Purta, but I was allowed to visit them. One day there was a tiger shoot, and we all had to spend the night at a magnificent camp in the countryside. I tell you, this Alice had quite a life in Africa. I mean, there was nothing like it. I mean, these are memorable and adventurous experiences. George and I shared a double tent with a partition. My bearer, who was like Nanny to me, much better you have the Lord's side of the tent than he have yours. We're actually almost to the end. I think there's just another page or so. This was for the benefit of midnight visitors. I've never discovered whether George had any or not. The tiger shoot itself was horrible. The chief guest was a bogus Russian prince, Midvani of Georgia, who accordingly sat on the biggest elephant in the most comfortable seat. Hundreds of beaters then drove a poor tiger out of the bushes and everyone fired at it. One could not have missed. My final days in India were spent with the Brabournes in Bombay, where Lord Brabourne was the governor. Bernard Norfolk turned up at the same time, also waiting for the ship to Mombasa. He too had been shooting tigers, as when he was now on his way to meet his cousin, Bernard Howard, the son of my parents' friend, Lady Maybelle Howard, to hunt big game in Kenya. Bernard's elder sister was my greatest friend, and I'd also known him since he was a little boy. Everyone naturally assumed we would have a romantic rendezvous. Most of the passengers on our boat proved to be Indians, and the only person we could place was a brother of Lady Furness, who was an Australian doctor. This discovery arose because the doctor, seeing me limping about, asked if he could be of any help. I showed him my leg, which by now was full of fluid, and he was horrified. He had no suitable equipment, but drained it as best he could with the aid of a fountain pen, and advised me to go straight to the hospital once I reached Kenya. On the way, the ship stopped at Seychelles. Bernard and I disembarked and went to Government House to ask if we could borrow a car. The governor lent us his, the only one on the island, and we drove to the end of the only road, a journey of 9 miles. The following evening, we landed at Mombasa. Bernard went off to join his cousin, and I traveled north to Deloraine. The doctor was right. My leg kept me laid up in Nakuru Hospital for 3 weeks. Not long after, bad news of my father's health arrived, and I was summoned home. It was the spring of 1935, and I set out on Jubilee Day. When we landed at Juba, we got off and listened to the King's speech on a very bad wireless in the district commissioner's office. Another Englishman had come over 50 miles out of the bush to listen. So there we sat, only just able to hear a far-off voice. And that's the end of chapter 8. And chapter 9 is the next chapter, and that's where she becomes more interested, the romance and the relationship. And first meeting Prince Henry takes off between Alice and Henry. But she's had some adventures. She's had quite a life. So I'm going to end it right there.